Imagine this. Midnight in the Norwegian fjords, year 873. The temperature has dropped to minus 42 degrees Celsius. Your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, forming crystals that cut your lips when you inhale. The darkness is absolute. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, but the suffocating blackness of a polar winter where the sun hasn't risen in 3 months and won't rise for 3 more. In this frozen hell, a family of 8 sleeps inside a wooden structure barely larger than a modern living room. By morning, they'll all be alive. You wouldn't last until dawn. The wind howling across the frozen wasteland isn't just cold. It's a physical force that strips heat from your body faster than your metabolism can generate it. Every gust carries microscopic ice particles that flay exposed skin like sandpaper made of glass. The snow beneath your feet isn't the romantic powder of holiday postcards. It's a thermal vampire that sucks warmth through any barrier you place between yourself and its surface. Stand still for 10 minutes, and hypothermia begins its methodical shutdown of your organs. Lie down to rest and you're committing suicide in slow motion. Yet the Vikings didn't just survive this. They thrived in it for generations. Modern humans, armed with Gore-Tex, synthetic insulation, and emergency heat packs, die in conditions Vikings considered mild autumn weather. Experienced mountaineers with decades of cold weather training freeze to death in environments that Viking children navigated barefoot. Search and rescue teams, equipped with satellite phones and thermal blankets, succumb to exposure in storms that Viking fishermen worked through as routine. The gap between their capability and ours isn't small. It's a chasm so vast it defies explanation. They possessed knowledge we've lost, engineered systems we don't understand, and executed protocols that modern survival experts can't replicate. This wasn't luck. This wasn't genetic superiority. This was intelligence so sophisticated, so brutally refined by generations of trial and lethal error, that it transformed ordinary humans into beings capable of conquering the unconquerable. Every technique they developed was tested against one unforgiving judge: death. If your insulation system failed, you died. If your food preservation miscalculated by 10%, your family starved. If your shelter design trapped smoke wrong, you suffocated. There was no margin for error, no second chances, no rescue helicopter coming at dawn. Didn't grade on a curve. It simply erased you. The Vikings you're about to meet aren't the Hollywood warriors with perfect teeth and leather armor. They're engineers who understood thermodynamics before the word existed. Chemists who prevented food poisoning without knowing bacteria existed. Architects who built structures that solved problems modern HVAC systems struggle with. They weren't surviving winter. They were defeating it with technology disguised as primitive simplicity. And the methods they used, the systems they engineered, the protocols they followed, they're more relevant to your survival today than anything you'll learn in a wilderness course. Because when the power grid fails and your heating system goes silent, you won't have modern technology to save you. You'll have what they had: knowledge, discipline, and the will to not die. Imagine this. You wake up at 3 in the morning in northern Norway, year 945. Not because your alarm rang or because you had a nightmare. You wake up because your body is screaming that it's dying. The temperature inside your shelter has dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. Outside, minus 43. The wind isn't howling. It's shrieking, a sound so primal it bypasses your ears and vibrates directly in your chest cavity. You can't see your hand in front of your face, not because it's dark, although it is completely, suffocatingly dark, but because the cold has already begun crystallizing the moisture in your eyes. This is what Vikings woke up to. Not once. Not during extreme weather events. Every single morning for 6 months straight. Let's establish what you're actually facing here. Because Hollywood has lied to you so completely that you don't even understand the scale of what winter meant in Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries. This wasn't a season. It was an extinction event that repeated annually. From October to April, the sun rose for maybe 4 hours per day. Not 4 hours of warm, productive daylight. 4 hours of weak, useless twilight that barely distinguished itself from the surrounding darkness. For the remaining 20 hours, you existed in blackness so complete that your brain began hallucinating shapes just to cope with the sensory deprivation. Temperature? The average winter low sat at minus 30 degrees Celsius. The extreme lows? Minus 50. That's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 3 minutes. Cold enough that your breath freezes into ice before it leaves your mouth, cutting your throat when you inhale. Cold enough that steel becomes brittle and shatters like glass. Now here's where it gets worse. And yes, it gets worse. You don't have electricity. You don't have central heating. You don't have synthetic insulation or waterproof materials or emergency services. You have wood, animal skins, and whatever food you managed to preserve during the 3-month summer growing season. That's it. That's your entire survival toolkit against 6 months of conditions that would kill a modern human in less than 12 hours. Think about that number. 12 hours. Elite mountaineers with decades of cold weather experience, equipped with the best gear modern technology can produce, die of exposure in temperatures Vikings considered mild. Search and rescue teams trained specifically for Arctic conditions succumb to hypothermia in storms that Viking children walked through to fetch water. The gap between their capability and yours isn't a gap, it's an abyss. You want to know the real horror? It's not the cold that kills you first. It's the cascade of failures your body experiences when exposed to sustained sub-zero temperatures. First, your extremities begin shutting down. Fingers, toes, ears, nose. Blood flow redirects to your core to protect vital organs. Within 30 minutes of exposure, you've lost fine motor control. You can't start a fire. You can't tie knots. You can't even grip a tool properly. Within an hour, your core temperature has dropped 1 degree. You're shivering violently now, an involuntary response that burns through your calorie reserves at 5 times the normal rate. 2 hours. You've stopped shivering. This isn't a good sign. It means your body has run out of fuel to generate heat. Your brain begins shutting down non-essential functions. Speech becomes slurred. Decision-making deteriorates. You start making the kind of mistakes that guarantee death, like deciding to rest, just for a moment. 3 hours. Moderate hypothermia. Your heart rate has dropped to 40 beats per minute. Confusion sets in completely. You might start removing your clothes because your brain is so oxygen-deprived, it interprets freezing as burning. 4 hours. You're unconscious. 6 hours. You're dead. Now imagine surviving that every single day for 6 months, multiple times per year, for your entire life. Not just surviving, thriving. Raising children, building ships, creating art, conducting trade expeditions across frozen seas. The Vikings didn't just endure winter. They operated at full capacity in conditions that would reduce you to a frozen corpse before lunch. How? Not through superior genetics, not through some mythical tolerance to cold. Through engineering so sophisticated it makes modern survival techniques look like amateur hour. They developed systems, interconnected protocols of architecture, clothing, food management, and social organization that transformed the impossible into routine. But here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't separate strategies. This was a unified survival algorithm where every component depended on every other component. Fail at one element and the entire system collapsed, taking everyone with it. Your shelter wasn't just a building. It was a thermodynamic machine that maintained livable temperatures using only fire and physics. Your clothing wasn't fashion. It was a portable microclimate system engineered down to individual fiber selection. Your food wasn't mere calories. It was a precisely calculated chemical stockpile designed to prevent both starvation and poisoning. Your social structure wasn't about community. It was about distributed survival redundancy, where every person executed specific thermal management tasks, or everyone died together. Let me paint you the full picture of what you're up against, because until you understand the complete threat profile, you won't appreciate the genius of Viking solutions. The darkness isn't just inconvenient, it's psychologically destructive. Human brains require light exposure to regulate circadian rhythms, produce vitamin D, and maintain serotonin levels. Without it, you descend into seasonal depression so severe it manifests as physical illness. Vikings spent 20 hours per day in darkness for half the year. The isolation isn't just lonely, it's logistically catastrophic. Snow buries trails, ice locks harbors, travel becomes impossible. If you run out of food, you can't hunt. If someone gets injured, you can't get help. You're sealed inside your location until spring. The wind isn't just uncomfortable. It's a heat-stripping mechanism that multiplies the effective temperature. -30 degrees with 30 km/h winds creates a wind chill of -45. Exposed skin freezes in 2 minutes. The precipitation isn't just wet. It's a death sentence if it touches your skin. Wet clothing loses 90% of its insulation value. Sweat against your skin in sub-zero temperatures pulls heat from your body 25 times faster than air. And yet the Vikings mastered this. They decoded the rules of an environment that wanted them dead and reverse-engineered protocols that not only neutralized the threats, but turned them into advantages. They transformed the darkness into strategic cover for winter raids. They converted the isolation into protected crafting time. They weaponized the wind patterns for navigation. They engineered the precipitation into drinking water systems. Every single element that should have killed them became a tool in their survival arsenal. This wasn't adaptation. This was domination. So before you continue thinking you could handle a Viking winter, before you trust your Gore-Tex jacket and your emergency blanket, before you assume modern technology makes you superior, understand this fundamental truth. Vikings possessed knowledge that modern humans have completely forgotten. Not because we evolved past it, but because we've become so dependent on artificial systems that we've lost the ability to interface directly with its brutality. When your heating fails, when your power grid collapses, when your supply chains break down, you'll have nothing. They had everything that mattered. The question isn't whether you could survive a Viking winter. The question is whether you're ready to learn from the people who did. Because the winter that erased civilizations didn't erase them, and the methods they used to defeat it, they're about to challenge everything you think you know about survival. Picture this scenario. You've just built yourself a shelter in Viking Norway, year 912. You're proud of yourself. It's got walls, a roof, and you've even managed to start a fire inside to keep warm. Congratulations. You've just created a death trap. Within 3 hours, you and everyone inside that structure will be dead. Not from the cold, from carbon monoxide poisoning. Your corpses will be found in the morning, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures, still positioned around the fire you thought was saving you. This is what happens when you don't understand that Viking shelters weren't buildings. They were thermodynamic survival machines, engineered with precision that most modern architects couldn't replicate. Let's destroy the Hollywood myth immediately. Viking longhouses weren't rustic cabins where everyone gathered around a roaring fire singing songs and drinking mead. They were sophisticated heat management systems designed to solve three simultaneous problems that each wanted to kill you in different ways. Problem 1. Generate enough heat to keep 30 to 50 people alive in minus 40-degree conditions. Problem 2. Ventilate smoke and carbon monoxide without losing that heat. Problem 3. Prevent moisture accumulation that would freeze everyone's lungs from the inside. Get any one of these wrong and you're excavating frozen corpses come spring. Vikings got all three right every single time for generations. Not through trial and error. There was no room for error. Through engineering that would make modern HVAC specialists question their entire education. Here's your first survival pillar: fire placement and fuel management. You're thinking, just build a big fire in the middle of the room, right? Wrong. That's suicide. A large fire in an enclosed space doesn't just risk carbon monoxide poisoning, it guarantees it. Vikings used a long, narrow fire trench running down the center of the longhouse. But here's the critical detail everyone misses. The fire wasn't continuous. It was segmented into multiple small fires, spaced precisely along the trench, each one managed independently. Why? Because small fires produce less smoke per unit of heat. They burn fuel more completely, creating less carbon monoxide. They're easier to control, preventing dangerous temperature spikes that would ignite the wooden structure. And most importantly, they create convection currents that work with the ventilation system instead of against it. Each fire was no larger than what you could contain in a modern cooking pot. 5 to 8 of these small fires provided more usable heat with less risk than one large bonfire. But fire placement is worthless without understanding fuel selection. And this is where Viking knowledge becomes genuinely frightening in its sophistication. You cannot burn fresh wood in a survival shelter. Fresh wood contains up to 60% water content. When you burn it, that water vaporizes into steam, which condenses on cold surfaces, which then freezes, which then creates ice inside your living space. Ice that grows thicker every day. Ice that eventually makes the structure uninhabitable. Vikings burned exclusively seasoned wood, timber that had been dried for minimum 18 months, reducing moisture content to below 20%. But even seasoned wood wasn't burned randomly. Oak provided long, steady heat, but produced heavy smoke. Birch burned cleaner, but faster. Pine contained resins that created dangerous creosote buildup. Vikings rotated fuel types in calculated sequences throughout the night, maximizing heat output while minimizing toxic accumulation. This wasn't campfire management. This was combustion chemistry, executed without thermometers, without moisture meters, without any modern measurement tools. Just generational knowledge encoded in protocols that everyone followed or everyone died. Second pillar: the ventilation system that defies physics. Your instinct says, seal everything tight to keep heat in. That instinct murders you. A sealed shelter with active fires creates a low-oxygen, high-carbon monoxide environment that kills you while you sleep. But opening vents loses heat so rapidly that hypothermia kills you just as dead. Vikings solved this impossible equation with a smoke hole system so precisely engineered that modern architects study it for passive ventilation design. The smoke hole wasn't just a hole in the roof. It was a calculated opening positioned at the exact apex of the peaked roof structure, sized to create negative pressure that pulled smoke upward without creating downdrafts. But here's the genius. The opening was adjustable. Wooden slats controlled the aperture size based on wind conditions, outside temperature, and internal fire intensity. Too small and smoke accumulates. Too large and heat escapes. Vikings adjusted this dozens of times per night based on changing conditions, reading smoke patterns and airflow with the precision of modern climate control engineers. But the smoke hole alone wouldn't work without the third component of the ventilation system: strategic air intake. Cold air entered the longhouse through deliberately placed gaps at ground level, positioned opposite the smoke hole. This created a convection loop. Cold air entered low, warmed as it passed over the fire trench, rose to the ceiling, and exited through the smoke hole. The incoming cold air was uncomfortable. Yes, you felt drafts at ankle level, but it was survivable. More importantly, it prevented carbon monoxide from pooling at ground level where people slept. Vikings didn't just tolerate these drafts, they engineered them. The gaps were sized and positioned to maintain airflow without creating wind tunnels. Moss and turf plugged temporary gaps during extreme cold, then were removed when conditions permitted. Every adjustment was a calculated trade-off between oxygenation and heat retention. This wasn't primitive shelter. This was fluid dynamics applied to architecture. Third pillar: insulation and thermal mass that most modern buildings can't match. Viking longhouse walls weren't just wooden planks. They were composite thermal barriers layered with materials that each served specific thermodynamic functions. First layer: thick wooden beams providing structural integrity. Second layer: packed turf, typically 30 to 40 centimeters thick, creating dead air spaces that blocked heat transfer. Third layer: interior wooden paneling that prevented moisture from the turf layer from entering living space. The turf wasn't random. It was cut from specific bog locations where plant roots created dense matting that wouldn't decompose. Placed grass side inward, root side outward, creating maximum insulation with minimum thickness. The roof used the same principle but inverted. Multiple layers of birch bark beneath the turf prevented water infiltration while maintaining breathability. This composite structure achieved an R value, that's thermal resistance measurement, equivalent to modern insulation rated at 15 to 20. Without fiberglass, without foam, without any synthetic materials. But insulation alone doesn't explain why longhouses stayed warm through 6-month winters. The secret was thermal mass, specifically the stone-lined fire trench and the packed earth floor. These weren't decorative choices, they were heat batteries. Stone and earth absorb heat during active fire hours, then radiate that heat for 6 to 8 hours after fires are extinguished. This meant Vikings could let fires die down during the coldest pre-dawn hours, the period when fuel reserves were most critical, and still maintain survivable temperatures from radiated heat. The stone lining was selected for specific properties: density, heat capacity, and resistance to thermal shock. Granite was preferred. Limestone cracked under repeated heating cycles. Sandstone crumbled. Vikings tested every local stone type through cycles of heating and cooling, encoding successful materials into building protocols. When you entered a longhouse, you weren't just entering a building. You were entering a carefully calibrated thermal system that had been tested against the only judge that mattered: survival. Now here's what holds this entire system together, and it's the part that reveals just how sophisticated Viking engineering truly was. Nothing worked in isolation. The fire management protocol depended on the ventilation system working correctly. The ventilation system depended on proper insulation, maintaining the temperature differential needed for convection. The insulation depended on the thermal mass distributing heat evenly. Remove any one component, and the whole system failed catastrophically. This wasn't architecture. This was systems engineering. Every person living in that longhouse had to understand their role in maintaining it. Children monitored smoke patterns. Women adjusted ventilation based on wind changes. Men managed fuel supply and fire rotation. Elder members supervised the entire operation, reading subtle environmental cues that indicated system stress. One person falling asleep on watch, one incorrect fuel selection, one ventilation adjustment made too late, and everyone paid the price. Modern humans look at a Viking longhouse and see primitive construction. Vikings looked at it and saw a machine that transformed lethal conditions into survivable space using only natural materials and physics. Your heated home with its thermostat and forced air system? It's a fragile dependence on technology that will fail you the moment the power grid collapses. Their engineered shelter? It worked without electricity, without fuel deliveries, without emergency services, through conditions that make your worst winter storm look like a mild inconvenience. They didn't conquer winter by being tougher than you. They conquered it by being smarter. And the shelter that kept them alive? It's still standing in your way, waiting to teach you that survival isn't about endurance. It's about engineering. Imagine this. It's November, year 983, somewhere in coastal Norway. The first major snowfall has sealed you inside your settlement for the next 6 months. You look at your food storage and start doing the mathematics of survival. 8 people in your family, 180 days until the thaw. 3 meals per day minimum to maintain body heat in sub-zero conditions. That's 4,320 meals you need to have already stored. Not fresh food. There is no fresh food. Not food you can hunt or gather. Nothing is alive out there. Preserved food that won't kill you with botulism, won't rot despite moisture, and won't be devoured by the rats that are just as desperate to survive as you are. Get this calculation wrong by even 10%, and you're choosing which family members starve first. Vikings never got it wrong. You want to know how? Because they treated food preservation like the life or death engineering problem it actually was. Let's start with the brutal truth that destroys every romantic notion you have about Viking diets. Most of what they ate would make you violently ill. Not because it was spoiled, because it was preserved using methods that fundamentally altered the food's chemistry into something your modern digestive system can't process. Fermented fish buried in the ground for months until it liquefied into a paste. Dried meat so hard, you had to soak it in water for hours before your teeth could penetrate it. Soured dairy products with bacterial cultures so aggressive, they would trigger immediate food poisoning in anyone not raised, consuming them from infancy. This wasn't cuisine. This was controlled decomposition designed to prevent uncontrolled decomposition. Vikings weren't eating food. They were eating chemical weapons they'd trained their bodies to tolerate because the alternative was starvation. First protocol: the salt equation that separated survivors from corpses. You need salt. Not for flavor, for cellular dehydration. Bacteria and mold require moisture to grow. Remove moisture from meat or fish, and you remove the ability for microorganisms to multiply. Sounds simple. It's not. Use too little salt and the interior of your meat rots while the exterior looks preserved. Use too much, and you've created food so osmotically concentrated, it pulls water from your digestive tract, dehydrating you faster than you can replace fluids in winter conditions, where water sources are frozen. Vikings calculated the exact salt-to-meat ratio through generations of lethal trial and error. For fish, 1 part salt to 3 parts fish by weight, applied in layers, compressed under stones for minimum 14 days. For red meat, 1 part salt to 4 parts meat, hung in cold storage for minimum 21 days. These weren't approximations. These were precise formulas that everyone followed, because one miscalculation meant feeding your family poison. But here's where Viking food chemistry becomes genuinely terrifying in its sophistication. They didn't just salt things and hope for the best. They engineered multi-stage preservation protocols that combined different chemical processes to create redundant safety systems. Take stockfish, dried cod that became the foundation of Viking winter survival. Stage 1. Catch the fish during the coldest months when natural bacteria levels are lowest. Stage 2. Gut and clean within 2 hours of death before internal bacteria begin colonizing the flesh. Stage 3. Hang in sub-zero temperatures where wind speed is constant but not extreme, creating airflow that desiccates without freezing. Stage 4. Monitor daily for 45 to 60 days, checking for signs of fat oxidation or fungal growth. Stage 5. Store in elevated racks where air circulates freely and rodents cannot reach. This wasn't fishing. This was pharmaceutical-grade quality control executed without microscopes, without humidity sensors, without any modern monitoring equipment. Just observation, pattern recognition, and protocols encoded through oral tradition. Second protocol: fermentation as controlled biological warfare. You're thinking fermentation is what happens to cabbage to make sauerkraut, right? Cute. Viking fermentation was weaponized chemistry that transformed potentially toxic food into shelf-stable nutrition through deliberate bacterial colonization. They buried fish in the ground, packed in salt and their own enzymes, where anaerobic bacteria broke down proteins into amino acids. They fermented milk into skyr, a proto-yogurt so acidic it killed harmful bacteria on contact. They preserved meat in whey, where lactic acid bacteria created an environment hostile to botulism spores. Each fermentation protocol required exact temperature ranges, precise timing, and constant monitoring. Too warm, and you grew the wrong bacteria, the kind that produce toxins that stop your heart. Too cold, and nothing fermented, meaning the food rotted normally. Vikings maintained fermentation temperatures within 2-degree ranges, using only earth insulation and seasonal timing. But the genius wasn't just in creating these preserved foods. It was in the rationing system that determined who ate what and when. This is where Viking food management reveals itself as pure mathematical optimization. Your calorie requirements vary based on your survival role. Men doing heavy labor, woodcutting, animal management, emergency repairs, burn 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day in extreme cold. Women managing indoor tasks burn 3,000 to 3,500. Children burn 2,000 to 2,500. Elderly members burn 1,800 to 2,200. Vikings calculated total community calorie requirements, then reverse-engineered daily rations to stretch stored food across the entire winter while maintaining minimum survival thresholds for each demographic. This meant some people were perpetually hungry. It meant children's growth was stunted. It meant elderly members existed on starvation-level rations. But it meant everyone survived until spring, when new food sources became available. The alternative, equal distribution that ran out in month 4, killed everyone. Third protocol: the invisible threat that murdered more Vikings than the cold ever did. Scurvy. You know what scurvy is? It's what happens when you don't consume vitamin C for 60 to 90 days. Your gums start bleeding, your old wounds reopen, your teeth fall out. Eventually, your cardiovascular system collapses and you die internally bleeding. There is no fresh fruit in a Norwegian winter. No fresh vegetables, no citrus, no natural vitamin C sources. Except Vikings didn't die of scurvy. You want to know their solution? It's so brilliant it sounds like cheating. They ate specific organs of preserved animals that concentrate vitamin C in their tissues: liver, kidney, brain. These organs store vitamin C at levels 10 to 20 times higher than muscle tissue. When Vikings preserved animals, they didn't just cure the meat. They specifically preserved and rationed organ meat to guarantee minimum vitamin C intake throughout winter. 100 grams of raw seal liver contains 45 milligrams of vitamin C. That's half your daily requirement. Vikings ate organ meat twice per week, minimum, throughout winter. Not because it tasted good. It tasted like concentrated iron and decay. Because the alternative was watching your teeth fall out while your body dissolved from the inside. But let's address the elephant in the frozen room. What happened when food stores ran out anyway? Because no matter how well you planned, random disasters occurred. Unexpected raids destroyed stores. Fires consumed food reserves. Rats found their way into preservation areas. When Vikings faced genuine starvation, they activated protocols that revealed just how brutally pragmatic their survival system truly was. First response: reduce rations to absolute minimum survival levels. That meant 400 to 600 calories per day. Enough to prevent death, but not enough to prevent severe malnutrition. Second response: begin consuming emergency stores specifically preserved for this scenario. Bone marrow, dried blood, preserved entrails. Foods so unpalatable they were only eaten when death was the alternative. Third response: the one nobody talks about, but everyone understood. Priority feeding based on survival value to the community. Breeding-age women received maximum rations. They represented future population. Children under 2 years received minimum rations. Their survival probability was too low to justify resource allocation. This wasn't cruelty. This was mathematics. When food is finite and death is certain for some, you choose who lives based on community survival probability, not sentiment. Now let's talk about something that makes modern nutritionists lose their minds. Viking diets were nutritionally incomplete by contemporary standards, and it didn't matter. They consumed almost no fiber. Their vitamin intake varied wildly by season. Their protein sources were repetitive to the point of metabolic stress, and yet they survived, reproduced, and thrived in conditions that would kill you in 6 weeks. Why? Because their bodies adapted through generational selection to extract maximum nutrition from minimum variety. Their gut bacteria evolved to process fermented foods efficiently. Their metabolic systems became optimized for extreme seasonal variation in calorie availability. Their genetic expression literally changed to accommodate the diet that kept them alive. You eating a Viking diet today? You'd experience permanent digestive damage within 3 months. Because you're not adapted. They were. Here's what modern humans completely miss about Viking food systems. This wasn't about eating well. It was about eating enough to not die while maintaining sufficient energy to execute all the other survival protocols that kept you alive. Food was fuel. Nothing more. The entire preservation system, the entire rationing protocol, the entire emergency hierarchy, it all existed to solve one equation: keep enough people alive through winter to rebuild the community come spring. Vikings who got sentimental about food died. Vikings who treated it as a chemical engineering problem lived. And the protocols they developed? They're still more reliable than your refrigerator and your supply chain, because when the power fails and the trucks stop coming, their methods will still work. yours won't. Imagine this. You're wearing your best winter jacket. Gore-Tex shell, synthetic insulation, moisture-wicking liner. State-of-the-art cold weather gear that cost you $600. You step outside into a Norwegian winter morning, year 927. Temperature, minus 38 degrees. You're going to help repair a fishing net, physical labor that takes 3 hours. Within 90 minutes, you're soaking wet from your own sweat. Within 2 hours, that moisture has frozen into a layer of ice against your skin. Within 3 hours, you're experiencing severe hypothermia despite wearing premium modern technology. By hour 4, you're dead. Your expensive jacket didn't just fail to save you, it actively killed you. Vikings working beside you in clothes made from dead animals? They're fine. Uncomfortable, cold, but alive and functional. You want to know why your technology failed and their primitive materials succeeded? Because they understood something modern outdoor companies have completely forgotten. In extreme cold, managing moisture is more important than trapping heat. Let's destroy your confidence in modern winter clothing immediately, because until you understand why it fails, you won't appreciate why Viking clothing worked. Your jacket is designed around a fundamental assumption. You'll be moving between heated spaces, car to office, house to store, brief exposures to cold with warm recovery periods. It's optimized for this use case. Waterproof exterior to block precipitation, synthetic insulation to trap warm air, sealed seams to prevent drafts. In mild winter conditions with heated refugees, it's perfect. In Viking conditions, extended physical labor and extreme cold with no heated recovery option, it's a death sentence. Here's why. Synthetic materials don't breathe. When you work hard, you sweat. That sweat has nowhere to go in a waterproof jacket, so it condenses on the interior surface. In sub-zero temperatures, condensed moisture freezes. Now you're wearing a jacket with an interior layer of ice in direct contact with your base layer. Ice conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air. Your insulation has become a heat sink that's actively killing you. First layer of Viking clothing genius. The base layer that defied physics. Vikings wore wool directly against their skin, not cotton. Cotton absorbs moisture and loses all insulation value when wet, guaranteeing hypothermia. Not modern synthetics, they didn't exist, but even if they had, Vikings would have rejected them for the same reason they'd reject your jacket. Wool. Specifically, wool from specific breeds of sheep raised in subarctic conditions, where natural selection had optimized fiber structure for extreme cold management. This wasn't regular wool. The fiber diameter was thinner, 18 to 22 microns versus 25 to 35 for modern wool. The crimp pattern was tighter, creating more air pockets per square centimeter. The lanolin content was higher, making the fiber naturally water-resistant. When you sweat in wool, the fiber absorbs up to 30% of its weight in moisture before feeling wet. But here's the critical detail. Wool absorbs moisture as vapor, not liquid. It pulls sweat away from your skin in gas form, preventing the liquid accumulation that leads to freezing. Even when fully saturated, wool retains 70% of its insulation value. Your synthetic base layer wet? Zero insulation. You're now wearing a heat conductor. But Vikings didn't just wear any wool in any configuration. They engineered a 3-layer system where each layer served a specific thermodynamic function, and the order mattered absolutely. Layer 1. Fine weave wool tunic against skin, tight enough to create a continuous fabric barrier, but loose enough to allow air circulation. This layer managed moisture and provided the first insulation boundary. Layer 2. Thick wool outer tunic, coarse weave with larger air gaps, worn loose to create a dead air space between layers. This was your primary insulation, not from the fabric itself, but from the trapped air between layer 1 and layer 2. Layer 3. Wool cloak or fur depending on activity level and weather severity. This outer layer blocked wind while remaining breathable enough to vent moisture vapor. The entire system worked on a principle modern clothing has abandoned: progressive moisture transport. Sweat vapor moved from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3 and then into the atmosphere, never condensing into liquid anywhere in the system. Remove any layer or change the material of any layer, and the whole system failed. Second layer of genius: the fur protocol that modern is only now understanding. Vikings didn't wear fur because it looked cool. They wore specific furs in specific configurations because they decoded the insulation properties of different animal pelts through generations of testing. Reindeer fur for extreme cold. Each hair is hollow, filled with air, creating insulation values that synthetic materials still can't match. Seal skin for wet conditions. Naturally waterproof, maintains flexibility in sub-zero temperatures, doesn't crack or stiffen when frozen. Bear fur for wind protection. Dense underfur plus long guard hairs creates a two-stage wind barrier that blocks air movement while remaining breathable. But here's what separates Viking clothing from modern fur garments. They wore fur in calculated combinations, not single pieces. A reindeer fur vest worn over wool, under a seal skin outer layer, with bear fur trim at the collar and cuffs. Each fur served a specific function in a specific location. Reindeer at the core for maximum insulation, seal skin on the exterior for moisture protection, bear fur at openings where wind penetration was highest. This wasn't fashion. This was materials engineering. Third layer of genius: the extremity management system that prevented frostbite. Your hands and feet are where you lose the battle against cold first, because blood flow to extremities decreases as your core temperature drops. Modern solution: thick insulated gloves and boots. Viking solution: layered coverings with active heat management. For hands, thin wool gloves as base layer, covered by mittens made from wool, felt, or fur. Why mittens over gloves? Because fingers together share heat. Isolated fingers in separate glove compartments each fight their own thermal battle and lose. For feet, wool socks, multiple pairs, each progressively looser than the previous to create air gaps. Leather boots insulated with dried grass or moss, replaced daily to prevent moisture accumulation. But here's the critical protocol. Vikings actively managed extremity circulation through deliberate movement patterns. Every 30 minutes during stationary work, mandatory hand and foot exercises to force blood flow to extremities, finger flexing, toe curling, arm swinging. This wasn't optional stretching. This was medical intervention to prevent tissue death. But the real sophistication in Viking clothing wasn't the materials or the layering. It was the moisture management protocol that governed how you wore these clothes. Because even the best material system fails if you violate the fundamental rules of cold weather clothing in extreme conditions. Rule 1: never let yourself sweat heavily. If your activity level increases to the point where you're perspiring, you immediately reduce clothing layers. Vikings would remove their outer cloak during heavy labor, working in just wool layers despite ambient temperatures of -30. Why? Because preventing sweat accumulation was more important than staying warm. You can always add layers back. You cannot remove moisture once it's saturated your clothing. Rule 2: dry everything every night. Every piece of clothing was hung near the fire, to drive out accumulated moisture. Even wool that felt dry contained water vapor that would freeze overnight if not actively dried. Vikings spent an hour every evening managing clothing maintenance. Not because they were obsessive, because moisture in clothing killed you during the next day's exposure. Rule 3. Change base layers daily. Sweat contains salts and oils that degrade wool's insulation properties. A wool tunic worn for 3 days without washing loses 20% of its thermal efficiency. Vikings maintained minimum 3 base layer tunics per person, rotating them through a wash-dry wear cycle throughout winter. Washing in winter without hot water? They used snow friction, literally scrubbing wool with snow to remove oils, then air drying in sub-zero temperatures. The freeze-thaw process killed bacteria and reset the fiber structure. Rule 4. Inspect everything daily for damage. A small tear in your outer layer creates a wind tunnel that collapses your entire insulation system. A hole in your boot lets in moisture that freezes your foot. Vikings conducted daily clothing inspections, the way modern pilots conduct pre-flight checks, methodically, completely, because failure meant death. Needle and thread weren't craft supplies. They were medical equipment. Now here's what modern humans completely fail to understand about Viking clothing. It was uncomfortable. Wool itches. Fur is heavy. Multiple layers restrict movement. You were never truly warm. You were just not cold enough to die. Vikings didn't achieve thermal comfort. They achieved thermal survival. There's a massive difference. Your modern jacket promises comfort. Viking clothing promised survival. When comfort and survival conflict, comfort kills you. Vikings chose survival every single time. The layering system was heavy, 5 to 8 kilograms of clothing on your body constantly. The maintenance was exhausting. Hours every week cleaning, drying, repairing. The cost was enormous. Outfitting one person required materials from multiple animals, hundreds of hours of labor, and constant resource allocation. But it worked. In conditions that make your best outdoor gear look like a costume, Viking clothing kept people alive and functional. So before you trust your Gore-Tex and your synthetic fleece, before you assume modern technology has solved cold weather survival, understand this. Vikings engineered clothing systems that worked in conditions where your equipment fails catastrophically. Not because they had better materials, they had worse materials. Not because they understood the better. They didn't know thermodynamics existed. Because they tested every solution against the only standard that mattered. Does it keep you alive? Your jacket was tested in a laboratory. Viking clothing was tested in an environment that killed everyone who got it wrong. There is no comparison. When the power fails and you can't buy new gear, when your synthetic insulation compresses and loses its loft, when your waterproof coating fails, Viking methods will still work. Because they always worked, even when everything else failed. Imagine this. You've mastered everything. You know how to build a thermally efficient shelter. You've preserved enough food to last 6 months. Your clothing system manages moisture perfectly. You're alone in your longhouse when a winter storm hits. Wind speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. Visibility 0. Temperature dropping to -45. You're tending the fire at 2 in the morning when carbon monoxide from a ventilation malfunction starts flooding the space. You don't notice because CO is odorless, and your judgment deteriorates before you realize anything is wrong. You fall unconscious. By dawn, you're dead. 3 meters away, a functional smoke hole could have saved you if someone had adjusted it when wind direction shifted. but you were alone. Vikings in the identical situation, they survive. Not because they're tougher, because they engineered social protocols that eliminated single points of failure. You die alone. They survived together. That difference is everything. Let's annihilate the modern myth of the self-sufficient survivor immediately. Individualism is a luxury of safe environments. In extreme conditions, the lone wolf fantasy isn't heroic. It's suicide. Every survival manual written by someone who actually survived extreme environments reaches the same conclusion. Group coordination beats individual skill every single time. Vikings didn't just understand this. They encoded it into social structures so rigid that violating protocol meant exile, which meant death. This wasn't about friendship or community values. This was about transforming a collection of individuals into a distributed survival system, where each person functioned as a redundant component in a machine designed to keep everyone alive. Remove one person, and the system degraded. Remove two, and it failed catastrophically. Vikings didn't tolerate individualism because individualism murdered everyone. First protocol: the watch rotation system that never failed. A Viking longhouse in winter required continuous monitoring 24 hours per day. Fire management, ventilation adjustment, smoke observation, temperature assessment, moisture control, structural integrity checks, food storage protection, and perimeter security. That's 8 critical tasks requiring constant attention. Fail at anyone, and you've created a scenario that kills everyone before morning. Modern humans think, "I'll just stay up and handle it." You can't. Human attention degrades after 2 hours of monotonous monitoring. After 4 hours, you're missing critical environmental changes. After 6 hours, you're making fatal errors in judgment. Vikings solved this with a rotation protocol where no person monitored for more than 2-hour blocks. 8 people in a household meant each person pulled 2-hour watch 3 times per day, with 6 hours between shifts for sleep and recovery. This wasn't negotiable. Children as young as 8 years old participated. Elderly members participated. Pregnant women participated. If you lived in that longhouse, you executed your watch shift or you were expelled, because one person sleeping through their shift created risk that killed 30 people. But the watch rotation wasn't just about staying awake. It was about executing specific tasks in specific sequences. Vikings didn't just monitor fires. They followed a protocol. Check each fire segment for proper burn pattern. Add fuel only to fires showing ember reduction. Adjust fuel positioning to optimize airflow. Verify smoke color for complete combustion. Confirm smoke hole draw before moving to next fire. That's 5 steps per fire segment, repeated every 30 minutes, for 8 fire segments. 40 discrete observations per cycle. Miss one observation, and you might not notice the fuel that started producing dangerous creosote. Mess up the sequence, and you might add fuel to a fire that doesn't need it, creating smoke accumulation that poisons everyone. The protocol existed because individual judgment failed under fatigue. Following the protocol, the exact same steps in the exact same order every single time, meant that even exhausted people could maintain system integrity through muscle memory when their cognitive function was compromised. Second protocol: the thermal management collective that redistributed heat. Here's a fact that destroys the concept of individual thermal survival. In sub-zero temperatures, people generate different amounts of body heat based on their metabolism, body mass, and activity level. Adult males generate the most. Small children generate the least. In individual sleeping arrangements, Children die of hypothermia while adults maintain survivable temperatures. Vikings engineered communal sleeping configurations that treated the entire household as a thermal unit. Sleeping platforms arranged by body heat generation. Highest heat individuals at the perimeter, lowest heat individuals at the center. Adults formed a thermal barrier that reduced heat loss for children. Multiple people under shared fur blankets created a microclimate that trapped collective body heat. But here's the genius. Sleeping positions rotated on a schedule. Perimeter positions, the coldest spots, rotated every 2 nights so no one person bore continuous thermal stress. This wasn't about comfort. This was about preventing the metabolic exhaustion that occurred when your body burned maximum calories every night, trying to maintain core temperature in the coldest position. But thermal sharing went beyond sleep. During the day, work assignments were distributed based on thermal output requirements. High heat-generating tasks, woodcutting, animal butchering, heavy repair work, were assigned to individuals showing signs of cold stress. Low-heat tasks, tool repair, textile work, food preparation, were assigned to individuals who just completed high-output work and needed thermal recovery. This meant you didn't choose your work based on preference or skill. You were assigned work based on your current thermal state as assessed by the household elder who monitored everyone's condition continuously. Refuse your assignment, and you were violating the protocol that kept everyone's body temperature in survivable ranges. Your thermal state affected everyone's survival, so your thermal management became everyone's responsibility. Third protocol, the resource distribution algorithm that eliminated conflict. When food is scarce and survival is uncertain, humans become violent. Competition for resources triggers the kind of social breakdown that kills communities faster than cold ever could. Vikings eliminated this through a rationing protocol so rigid it removed all individual decision-making. Food distribution wasn't based on hunger, wasn't based on preference, wasn't based on contribution. It was based on a calculated formula: body mass times activity level times survival value to community equals daily calorie allocation. An adult male doing heavy labor received 4,000 calories. An adult female managing indoor work received 3,000. A child received 2,000. An elderly non-working member received 1,800. These numbers weren't negotiable. They weren't adjusted for complaints or hunger or fairness. They were mathematical outputs of a formula that maximized community survival probability. Everyone received exactly their calculated ration, measured precisely, distributed at fixed times, consumed under observation to prevent hoarding. But the protocol didn't just distribute food, it distributed the psychological burden of scarcity. In modern scenarios, whoever controls food distribution gains power, which creates resentment, which creates conflict, which destroys cooperation. Vikings eliminated this by making distribution a rotating responsibility. Every adult took turns as ration manager for 1 week, following the exact formula, facing the exact same complaints, bearing the exact same psychological weight. This created system-level understanding. Everyone experienced how impossible it was to satisfy individual desires when resources were finite. Everyone learned that the protocol wasn't cruel. It was the only thing preventing starvation. By rotating the burden, Vikings eliminated the us versus them dynamic that destroys communities under resource stress. When everyone had been the person saying no to hungry children, no one could claim the system was unfair. It was equally brutal to everyone. Fourth protocol, the skill redundancy mandate that prevented knowledge loss. Here's how communities die. The one person who knows how to do a critical task dies or becomes incapacitated, and the skill dies with them. Vikings eliminated single-person dependencies through forced skill redundancy. Every critical survival skill had to be mastered by minimum 3 people in the household. Fire management, 3 people trained to expert level. Food preservation, 3 people. Clothing repair, 3 people. Tool maintenance, 3 people. This meant children started learning adult survival skills by age 6. This meant elderly members taught continuously until they physically couldn't. This meant no one got to specialize exclusively in what they enjoyed. If the community only had 2 people who could repair fishing nets, and you had the aptitude, you were learning net repair whether you wanted to or not. Because when one of those 2 people died, and people died regularly in Viking conditions, the remaining person needed backup immediately. But skill redundancy wasn't just about training, it was about continuous validation. Every month, rotating skill demonstrations where each person executed their assigned survival task, while others observed and critiqued. You thought you knew how to manage smoke ventilation? Demonstrate it. Show the entire household your decision-making process. Explain why you adjusted the smoke hole that specific amount in those specific wind conditions. Defend your choices to people whose lives depended on your competence. This public validation served 2 functions. It revealed skill degradation before it caused failure, and it continuously updated everyone's knowledge as conditions changed and techniques improved. Modern humans hate this kind of scrutiny. Vikings demanded it, because private incompetence became public death when winter storms hit. Now here's what holds all these protocols together, and it's the piece that reveals why Viking survival was fundamentally different from anything modern humans understand. There was no individual survival. You couldn't opt out. You couldn't decide to handle things yourself. You couldn't prioritize your comfort over system efficiency. Your survival was mechanically linked to everyone else's survival through protocols that made independence impossible. You didn't feed yourself. The community fed you based on your calculated needs. You didn't keep yourself warm. The community positioned you in thermal configurations that optimized collective heat retention. You didn't sleep when tired. You slept when your rotation schedule permitted. You didn't work on tasks you preferred. You worked on tasks the system required. Every single aspect of your existence was subordinated to collective survival protocols. Modern humans call this oppressive. Vikings called it Tuesday. This is why you die in conditions Vikings survived. Not because you lack their skills. You could learn every technique they knew. Not because you lacked their equipment. You could replicate every tool they used. Because you can't replicate their social structure. You can't force yourself to surrender individual autonomy to collective protocols. You can't maintain 24-hour watch rotations when you're alone. You can't redistribute heat you're not sharing. You can't rotate skills through people who don't exist. Your entire cultural framework is built on independence, self-reliance, and individual achievement. Viking survival required the opposite: dependence, collective reliance, and subordination of individual needs to system requirements. When conditions get extreme enough that survival requires coordination, your individualism kills you. Their collectivism saved them. And that difference? It's not something you can overcome with better gear or more knowledge. It's structural. It's fundamental. It's why they survived, and you won't.